Now, when we think about the diffusion that's happening between the alveoli and the blood, it's pretty rapid. And the reason it's pretty rapid is because of two things. One, we spoke about, well, both of these we spoke about, the small diffusion barrier, so that very thin respiratory membrane. And I keep reiterating the structure because it's so important that we talked about it before, the endothelial cell, the alveolar type 1 cell, and that fused basement membrane, which constitutes the respiratory membrane. So it's a very thin or small diffusion barrier. And the second thing we also spoke about, which is that large surface area, the rich branching of the alveoli, right? Many, many alveoli, many clusters, as well as the dense, rich capillary network that lines the alveoli, which provides this really large surface area for gas exchange. So that's the reason that that blood is transferring so rapidly from the alveolus to the blood, or vice versa, if you think about the different gases. So from the blood to the alveolus in terms of carbon dioxide, but from the alveolus to the blood in terms of oxygen. So that is happening very quickly because the membrane is so thin and because there's such a large, extensive surface area for exchange. Now, in order to combat that, we think about the length of the capillary and how the partial pressure changes quite quickly, and how there's very rapid offloading of these gases that allows for the efficient exchange of the gases. So kind of just to give some context here, we're thinking about the length of the capillary here. So we go from the proximal part of that capillary all the way down to the very distal end, being 100, and we're comparing that to the partial pressure of oxygen here on the Y. So basically, we start at 40, which is the presence of our mixed venous blood. So that mixed venous partial pressure of oxygen is about 40 millimeters of mercury. And by the time we get a third the length of the entire capillary, all of the oxygen has been loaded into the blood, okay? So all of the oxygen has been loaded into the blood within the first 33% of the entire length of that capillary. And what this means is that we can speed up the rate of exchange about 3 times the rate at rest, and we would still have efficient exchange of oxygen, okay? I'll say that again. So essentially we have the entire length of the capillary, and after the blood has passed through the first third of the length of the capillary, all of the oxygen has been loaded from the alveolus into the blood, into the capillaries, and that is represented here by the change in the partial pressure. So we go from 40, which is the lowest partial pressure in that mixed venous blood, all the way to 100, which is the partial pressure of our freshly oxygenated blood. In other words, all of the exchange takes place within the first third of that capillary. And this is really a protective mechanism. So we could potentially speed up the rate of blood flowing through this capillary bed and still have maximum exchange of gases. Okay, we could speed this rate up 3 times what it typically is. Okay, because all of this oxygen has been exchanged within the first third. So if I were to speed up how fast blood is flowing through the capillary bed, there would still be enough time for all of the oxygen to be loaded from the alveolus into the capillary. Okay, and this becomes important as we think about exercise, as we think about the fight or flight or freeze, right? That sympathetic response, which would speed up the rate of blood flow, right? Blood is moving faster through our vasculature. And so if we didn't have this mechanism, let's say it would take the entire length for the blood to move from the alveolus to the capillary, then if we sped up the rate, then we would actually, we would lose some of the oxygen that would be transferred because it would take more time, okay? As we speed up the rate that blood is moving through our capillaries, we actually decrease the amount of time that's needed for diffusion. And so if we didn't have this idea here where all of the oxygen is being transferred in that first third, we would not be able to facilitate speeding up the rate of blood flow through our capillaries and still maintaining efficient gas exchange, okay? And we see that same exact phenomenon with the partial pressure of CO2. So as CO2, as blood is moving through the length of our capillary here, and we think about the partial pressure change of CO2, So CO2 goes from its highest state in the mixed venous blood, where we have all of that CO2 present, waiting to be offloaded into the alveolus, all the way down to 40, which is the lowest reading in our alveoli, okay? And so within the first third of the length of our capillary, all of that CO2 has been offloaded. And again, this is a protective mechanism. If we were to speed up the rate at which blood was flowing through our capillary, we would potentially lose the amount of CO2 that can be offloaded if we didn't have this rapid movement where all the CO2 was offloaded within that first third of the length of the capillary, okay? So we could speed up the rate of capillary flow 3 times its resting rate and still see adequate or efficient gas exchange of oxygen as well as CO2. Okay. And then the final thing that we'll say here is basically kind of putting that together, all that we've just said, in terms of the gases diffusing down their own partial pressure gradients. So if you think about the gradient that we described for oxygen, it's lower or at 40 millimeters of mercury in our cells and tissues, right, in our systemic capillaries, all the way to 100 millimeters of mercury in our systemic arteries. And so we can see a gradient here, right? A gradient that favors oxygen diffusing from the systemic arteries in our blood out into the cells and tissues, okay? And then when we get back to our systemic veins, all of that oxygen has been offloaded. And so we see our lowest recorded partial pressure of oxygen, which is 40 millimeters of mercury. The opposite, or the same idea, but the opposite direction is true for CO2 as well. CO2 is usually greater than or at 46 millimeters of mercury at the level of our cells and tissues. And then it goes all the way down to 40 millimeters of mercury in our systemic arteries, okay? And this is freshly oxygenated blood that has just had all that oxygen removed and is now re-entering that circulatory system. And so we see a gradient here once again. High CO2 at the level of cells and tissues, low CO2 at the level of our systemic arteries. And so that favors the movement of carbon dioxide, from our cells into our blood. In other words, carbon dioxide is being picked up from our cells and tissues where it's being produced into the blood so that it can be circulated back to the alveolus to be released. And so if we think about, again, our systemic veins, it's going to be the highest recorded reading of our partial pressure of CO2 because this blood in our systemic veins has all of that CO2 that's being collected from all of our respiring tissues. Okay.